Back in the early days of virtual reality, pretty much any title that could provide us with a unique VR experience was fair game. That's no longer the case though, because in this evolving industry, developers are moving towards making games more like games and less like demos. That said, Bonelab released 3 years after the quirky success that was Boneworks, and today, we're going to review Bonelab the same way we review all games on this channel, breaking them down into 6 categories, scoring them individually, and giving you a more complete picture at the end of the video. Stick around because the final score is representative of the overall experience while the categories are more so focused on the technical stuff. Do I really believe 9,000 of these reviews are wrong? There's only one way to find out. Timestamps are in the description, and with that said, insert trigger warning here, and let's move on to the first category. This game is essentially a physics playground, so we'll start by looking at the mechanics, and as you probably already know, physics and bugs tend to go hand in hand in any video game. Spoiler alert, Bonelab is no exception. Before I get into that though, I need to highlight a few awesome things here. One of which is how awesome it is that you can use anything as a weapon in this game. You'll have a lot of actual weapons available throughout your playtime, like different kinds of guns and melee weapons for the more civilized amongst us. Putting aside things that were actually intended to be weaponized though, you can pick up objects like tables and chairs, effectively using them as tools of subtle persuasion. The environment itself is your weapon, and it really feels like the only limit is your imagination. That said, you better have a very active imagination because the controls will fight you hard. Parkour and physical movement are such big players in this game that not only did they design an entire body swapping mechanic around the idea, they added entire modules and levels specifically for it. This is wild given how flat out frustrating movement can be in this game. This is a game, but the struggle is very real here. On too many occasions, I find myself either getting my arm stuck on objects outside of the view of my headset or being unable to climb things any normal person otherwise would be able to. This movie-like level where you're playing as a fast chick running from a helicopter on rooftops is a lot cooler in concept once you experience it in Bonelab. Climbing things in this game flat out feels like you are not in control of your own body, and there's no getting around that. Climbing aside though, enemies kept doing very weird things throughout my experience. I mean like wonky, physics-based game levels of weird. And the icing on the enemy flavored cake is that the headset crabs seem tankier than most other enemies, which for some reason feels less like a feature and more like a bug. Unfortunately, mechanics gets a 2 out of 6 here. This game still has a cool inventory management system just like its predecessor, and it's insanely cool how realistic reloading looks when you can see your bullets actually getting chambered. Unfortunately and ironically, the controls make you feel like you have very little control, and with movement being such a big part of the game, it hurts this category's score big time. Worse than how my stomach felt playing certain parts of the game actually, and this just happens to be a great segue to the next category, motion aids. Let me preface this category by saying I've spent hundreds of hours in VR and I have never once gotten motion sick. Ever. Or at least that's what I would be saying had I never actually played this game. Granted, this game does have traditional motion aids like adjustable height control and snap turning, there are just too many intense parts of this game that these aids cannot compensate for. One of many particular examples is the racetrack level. Terrible controls for this go-kart aside, I should have known this level would likely make me sick when I saw a poster on the wall saying laps could be completed by running, which is exactly what I had to do for the entire last lap. The way this go-kart jerks you around is so bad, it's unlikely you'll make it through this section without your stomach turning, and there's no built-in motion aid that can fix that here. I know, we just finished mechanics and controls belong there, but I'm a fan of actually being able to enjoy experiences provided in VR, and the lack of polish on these controls directly translates to this category. Motion aids gets a 3 out of 6 because the aids in this game do exist and are relatively well done, with the exception of being unable to experience these experiences created with the intention of being experienced, but ultimately giving your stomach an experience that this category was intended to mitigate. And speaking of experiences, let's move on to the next category, Immersion. If you've seen my previous videos, this category used to be called Player Agency, but just know it's the same thing. That said, the immersion scale is pretty off the charts in this game. Those exact same control problems that plagued the previous categories actually do the exact opposite here. In Bonelab, you're trapped inside this physics-based virtual space, and if almost everything in this virtual space is wonky, why should you expect your physical body not to be, right? This would be a good time to reiterate that these individual categories are technical and isolated from each other. Your overall experience is not, which is why the overall score at the end is more indicative of your actual experience. That said, this game is so bugged, inconsistent, and frustrating that Immersion can only receive a perfect score of 6 out of 6 in this category. It makes perfect sense because it's unable to make perfect sense, and I may seem like I'm speaking nonsense, but don't just take my word for it. Look at the evidence. The clipboards don't actually show you anything until you pick them up, which is weird at first, and the controls will give you the alcoholic experience you always never actually wanted. But again, you're in a physics-based virtual environment, and from an immersion perspective, you should literally expect nothing to work the way it's supposed to here. Why is that, you ask? Because we've already established that physics and bugs go hand in hand in video games, and guess what? You're essentially stuck the entire experience in one massive game. This category gets a 6 out of 6 because it doesn't even stop there. The world is so janky and it knows the jank itself will likely kill you, so it tried to create a matrix within the matrix by putting these headcrabs in the game that lunge at you and attempt to trap you in what I can only assume is an even jankier experience than what you're already experiencing. But now that we're aware that we've actually been immersed this whole time, let's move on to a category that didn't actually help us get here. We've pretty much established that the story involves us being trapped in this virtual space, but the overall theme itself does little to foster that initial understanding. There is a story here, but it's not very well defined. You'll be expected to reach your own general conclusions as you go about your business. Throughout the game, you'll find random clipboards that give you peeks into the minds of different Monogon employees. Some of these clipboards have seemingly random information on them, but it doesn't make them any less entertaining to read though. That said, the good news is it's not necessarily bad that this game feels less story-driven and more world-building focused. You get little windows into your complicated situation with the occasional big story moment thrown in. The bad news is that theme gets a 3 out of 6 because this is very much a sandbox experience, but unlike its predecessor Boneworks, the story in Bonelab feels a little too much like an afterthought here. What doesn't feel like an afterthought here though is the audio. I'll turn up the gameplay volume for this category so you can get a feel for the sound as I talk about it briefly, but in a nutshell, the audio doesn't disappoint. All of the sounds here are nice and crisp, from the sound of objects falling to the sounds of them breaking. The team at Stress Level 0 did a pretty awesome job with the audio in a sense that everything you can interact with has an appropriate audible effect. The sound of bullet casings hitting the ground sounds very clean and realistic, and even the headcrabs make this weird sound when they lunge at you that triggers a genuine feeling of danger. Seriously, just the sound of landing a jump in this game makes it feel awesome. This category gets a 6 out of 6 because they've nailed pretty much everything here, from the ambient noises to the original music for this game. If you appreciate quality audio and decide not to buy the game, you should at least consider buying the original soundtrack. I'll leave a link in the description if you're interested in that, and no, I'm not sponsored, so that's a genuine shout out. Moving on though, lastly and definitely not least, we'll look at the visual quality here. For the most part, I have few complaints about how this game looks, but for reference, the first thing I do when I hop into these games is turn the graphics settings to max. From the weapons to the environment and even the enemies, everything has an acceptable aesthetic that complements the overall design. There were definitely some head-turning moments like this Minecraft looking whatever this is, but there actually wasn't much of this. I've seen plenty of cases where games had varying texture qualities on all kinds of surfaces and they seemed really inconsistent and out of place. You'll be pleased to know that's not the case here. Unless I'm actively looking for these mismatched textures, they're really hard to find and blend really well. This category gets a 4 out of 6. It would have been higher, but I ran into strange visual bugs more than once in my playthrough. One notable time was when climbing through a kitchen vent, the screen started flickering, but it only flickered at the highest point of the vent, which actually freaked me out a bit because I wasn't alone in there. That aside though, visual quality is overall decent. And with that said, let's look at the overall experience, but you should know something first. Many of these games are games I've never played before reviewing them, and I approach them with the same genuine uncertainty you'll likely experience before you buy them. I like the idea of putting myself in your shoes so I can approach the overall review with you in mind. That said, Bonelab is a genuine anomaly for me. I did enjoy my experience, but I can't see myself hopping back into it in my free time. This game has built-in mod support, but my initial experience had so many jarring moments that I didn't even want to open up that can of worms. And I love worms. Mods. I love mods. Good visuals are nice, don't get me wrong, but I feel like the sound and immersion factor carried me through most of my playtime. In a sandbox game, if nothing else, mechanics should be the key player, and that simply wasn't the case here. Immersively speaking, it's understandable why movement is janky, but it didn't make the experience any less frustrating when trying to do simple things like climbing ledges and opening doors by the handle. Unfortunately, Bonelab walks away with a 3 out of 6 here. This style of game is very uncommon, and the only comparable title would be its predecessor, Boneworks, which on the same scale beat Bonelab in almost every category. So with that said, again, do I really disagree with over 9,000 positive reviews? Absolutely, or this video would have been clickbait. I can appreciate what the developers were going for here, giving players more of the content they loved in Boneworks, but unfortunately Bonelab just doesn't stack up. And with that said, thank you so much for watching. I'd especially like to thank my subscribers. Just looking at my sub count puts a genuine smile on my face because it tells me I'm bringing value to at least 11 of you at time of writing. For those of you who haven't subscribed, you should consider doing so and hitting the notification bell because I've got new reviews dropping weekly. With that said, leave a comment if there's any specific game you'd like for me to review. Stay healthy, and until next time, stay immersed.